Now, in the next paragraph that we are going to begin today, the reading of the paragraph that we are going to begin today, what most important things or characteristics he describes here is, first, poetry is not the transmission of the things in themselves, rather of the poet's experience of these things. Poetry is not really the transmission of or the conveyance of or the expression of what the things are actually in themselves, but rather when the poet experiences these things, what occurs after it forms a part of poetry. Or, in other words, especially the aesthetic theory of Mr. Wordsworth, it says that poetry is essentially the conveyor of, the expression of a poet's hyper acute perceptions and experiences. Poetry is nothing but a conveying of a mode by which he conveys his own hyper acute perception towards the outer world and his own experiences towards these objects through writing. Now let's continue with the reading of the text, and since we have finished with the last paragraph, let's move on to the next one. I'm going to begin with, I cannot however be insensible of the present. I am going to begin with this line, that is, I cannot however be insensible. Please find it out quickly and open up your textbooks. I cannot however be insensible of the present outcry against the triviality and meanness both of thought and language, which some of my contemporaries have occasionally introduced into their metrical compositions. Now, of course, he is going to begin with the continuation of the criticism that used to happen during the transition period, that is, the transition period after neoclassicism had seen its optimum or the best of its art pieces, and till the time the romanticism was clearly on the literary landscape. So in the middle of the time, that is the interim period, the period between when neoclassical poetry or the neoclassical idiom, when it was in its optimum form, when it started to gradually disappear, and a new form was being looked for. And when you're trying to experiment through the poetic form, you're trying to experiment at the level of thought and language, when as a poet you're trying to get away or from the older forms of following the rules, then of course it will give rise to some of the trials and errors. And this trials and errors, that is what he's talking of. That is, I cannot however be insensible to the present condition, present poetic scenario, which has, of course, allowed the elements of triviality, meanness at the level of thought and language, but some of my contemporaries have occasionally introduced into their metrical composition, and I acknowledge this defect. So that's the reason he says, I cannot, however, be insensible of the present outcry against the triviality and meanness both of thought and language, which some of my contemporaries have occasionally introduced into their metrical compositions, and I acknowledge this defect. And I acknowledge that this defect, wherever it exists, is more dishonorable to the writer's own character than in the sum of its consequences. So, first few lines are important, that he's acknowledging the fact that some of the elements of triviality and lack of good thought, lack of good language has crept into this poetic composition, which some of the contemporaries of Wordsworth have introduced. They have somewhere compromised upon the metrical compositions. They have brought in this newer forms, but this is somewhere reflective of their own character, poetic character, rather than forcibly trying to bring up the element of arbitrary innovation, right? Or this sounds or this appears more like an arbitrary or capricious habit of expression rather than some real poetic innovation. Now let's read further, and I'm reading directly from the text. From such verses, the poems in these volumes will be found distinguish, at least by one mark of difference, that each of them has a worthy purpose. So he's trying to differentiate, he's trying to clearly set himself away, apart from these class of contemporary poets who have somewhere introduced the element of triviality, the element of capriciousness, the element of their own whims and fancies as the part of poetic idiom. And he's distinguishing himself how? He's distinguishing that my verses or the poems that I've introduced in this volume, that is lyrical ballads, they will be different from these contemporaries with one difference. They will be different from these contemporaries with one visible apparent difference, and that visible apparent difference is they all have a worthy purpose. Now, what does he exactly mean by this particular word, worthy purpose? And if you pay attention, this word purpose is italicized. And before I give you the description of the term, this italicized particular word purpose, let's read a bit further, and he himself is explaining what does this purpose thing means. So after a few lines, he says, my habits of meditation have so formed my feelings as that my description of such objects as strongly excite those feelings will be found to carry along with them a purpose. So he says that any particular poem that you'll find in my composition, that is in this volume of lyrical ballads, they all will have a purpose. And by that purpose, he means that whatever objects I have chosen to describe, they all excite some strong feelings. But there's a catch here. He says that these strong feelings are not something that the moment I looked at a particular beautiful object of nature and certain feelings that got generated and I've penned those feelings down. No, this is not the kind of feelings he says. He says that the description of such objects have come out of my habit of meditation, and this habit of meditation have formed my feelings. Now, what does he mean exactly by this my habit of meditation? And I think I've mentioned it earlier that with the term meditation, he doesn't simply say that meditation in the common sense, that we sit cross-legged together and we close our eyes and, take up a some spiritual phrase or mantra and keeps on chanting about it. No, this is not the kind of meditation he's focusing on. The term meditation for him the term meditation for him meant contemplation, thinking about something, forcibly thinking about something. And if we go by the biographical life or the kind of life Wordsworth had lived earlier, you'll find that he has spent most of his life in quiet contemplation. Right? And this was the result of the generation of these feelings. That is, his habits of meditation, his habits of contemplation have disciplined his feelings. I repeat it again. This habit of meditation, this habit of contemplation have disciplined his feelings, and as a result of this deep, sustained, habitual contemplation, whatever feelings that give rise to, that is what he decides to pen down. That is what he decides to use through language, bring up through language. Now, let's get back to our reading and let's reread this line of worthy purpose. He says, I believe that my habits of meditation have so formed my feelings. These habits of meditation, these habits of contemplation, these long, sustained, deep habits of contemplation or mindful thinking, quiet mindful thinking have resulted in a kind of discipline for my feelings. They have disciplined my feelings because I have been for a longer time paying attention cognitively, thinking wise to these objects or to simple contemplation, and as a result my feelings have become disciplined, right? My habits of meditation have so formed my feelings as that my description of such objects as strongly excite those feelings will be found to carry along with the purpose. And as a result of this disciplining of feelings and how these feelings are disciplined, when you are continuously, or when you have this habit of meditation, when you have this habit of contemplation, or someone who is an introvert, someone who would like to observe things quietly, someone who decidedly go for, say, deeper levels of contemplation, the moment they are trying to pen down something, these introverts, when they try to pen down some things, they can clearly rummage through their feelings that have gone into and perforate through those feelings, and they will take up the best ones. They will take out the best description of those feelings, of those objects, and write it down. That is why if you try and find the best of the poets that have existed, they had been nothing but the introverts. And let me also tell you that poetry is born out of contemplation. This is what even Wordsworth says. Poetry is born out of contemplation. Poetry is born in contemplation, in the meditative recollection of a particular feeling rummaged through past, summoned from the past.